Welcome to this online lecture on technology and innovation management. In this brief lecture, I will cover two aspects of digital transformation, and we will start with the first, changes in traditional organizing strategies because of digitalization. To watch this video, you have to complete a task first. In particular, I want you to watch another short video, an online lecture called The Transformative Effect of Digitization on Organizing, given by Professor J.P. Eggers from New York universities. He gave this lecture at an open session from the International Research Conference Organizing for Digitalization in November 2016, and the lecture is available on YouTube. The YouTube video contains actually two sessions, two lectures, but for this exercise, I want you to watch the first part, which starts about roughly 3 minutes 55 and ends at about 21 minutes of the YouTube recording. Beforehand, you will hear a few introductions, and after the 21st minute, there is another speaker that we'll talk about later. In this lecture that JP Eggers gives, I want you to pay attention to which traditional organizing strategies he refers to that are changing because of digitalization and how. If you're interested to learn more about this talk, he is referring to one of his works, a particular paper which is called Incumbent Adaptation to Technological Change, Past, Present, and Future of Research on Heterogeneous Incumbent Responses, which appeared in the Academy of Management Annals, and a copy is provided to you on your course platform. Now, before I continue, it is important that you watch the lecture by JP Eggers first, and then come back and continue listening to this recording. So at this stage, I will assume that you have watched the video, and this is just my summary of the content that he referred to. Now, he mentioned several organizing strategies that have been quite established for many firms and that are changing because of digitalization. The first one is a very famous one, namely transaction costs, or the entire theory about transaction cost economics. Now, that strategy usually implies that you want to look at procedures from a transactional cost point of view, meaning that you try to minimize the costs of doing certain transactions through a variety of strategies. Now, JP Eggers like that through digitalization, transaction costs basically disappear. They don't fully disappear, but the costs of transaction costs become marginally tending towards zero, so they become much less relevant in what. Why is that? Because if you can transport a lot of information that you might need to organize your supply chain, to connect with your customers, to perform sales and distribution, if you can do many of these things online, then typical transaction costs, such as having a meeting, driving around with a sales truck, having people employed in distribution centers, organizing the supply chain by driving out to your suppliers, stuff like this. All these costs of conducting these transactions in the online world basically approach zero costs. They're not free completely, but they're relatively speaking, they're free, so they shouldn't be strategically relevant anymore. A second key organizing strategy that is changing because of digitalization are coordination. Now, historically, firms have had integrated hierarchies with centralized governance because that is a very efficient coordination mechanisms. If you can instruct people and workers and processes from the top down, if you have hierarchical, vertically integrated coordination. Again, because the costs of doing informational transactions, sharing and communicating with each other, basically approach zero and become available anytime, anywhere, any place, firms now can choose different governance forms, not just the classical integrated vertical hierarchy. One prominent manifestations for that are what are now called platform ecosystems. So organizations and their partners that are organized as partners on platforms that basically access relevant assets, information, and other resources without necessarily owning them. Ownership was a typical form in centralized governance, so you're much better at having full ownership, full control over your organizational resources. That becomes less relevant now that access to resources becomes much more relevant than ownership. And finally, a third aspect of organizing that is changing is the class of resources or assets and how we manage them. Now, typically, firms are being viewed as bundles of resources or strategically relevant assets, as you would know from the resource based view of the firm. But now that we can move from ownership models to access or subscription models, we first of all see a whole bunch of new digital resources or assets that are being provided by other firms and then made accessible, for example, through subscription models. A classical example here is what's known as Amazon Web Services, who Amazon is providing is a great array of all sorts of digital resources and assets that you would need if you want to do digital commerce. Now, this could be a web space, could be interfaces, could be algorithms, all these sorts of things. And they're selling them not for other firms to own, but rather to subscribe to. A second thing that changes in the asset management realm is that many pieces of digital resource infrastructure is actually broadly adopted, dispersed in the general public. Think about the fact that many, if not most, people in the Western world do have computing devices, smartphones, tablets, laptops or other kinds of things readily at hand. Literally every person has that and is running around with them. And we have a lot of other types of infrastructure that's also basically available, like the app stores, but also production facilities like 3D printers or Raspberry Pis. These things become basically generally accessible. They're not exclusive, they're not very expensive, and they are being broadly adopted, meaning that all of a sudden we can rely on these assets being available for us to access without us having to own them. So these are three traditional strategic considerations of firms. How do we handle transactions? How do we coordinate? What are our resources and assets, and how do we manage them, that are fundamentally changing because of digitalization, which is one form of digital transformation. The second aspect I want to cover here, which is related to this first, are changes to traditional firm growth strategy because of digitalization. So the question of how does a firm grow its capacity, its volume, its number of employees, anything like that. Now, this part is connected to the first because it draws on a online lecture, this time given by Professor Ola Henfridsen, who's now with the University of Miami. Back then, he was with the University of Warwick in England, about rapid scaling of digital ventures. And it was given at the same open session from the International Research Conference, Organizing for Digitalization, where you also watched the lecture by JP Eggers from NYU. So again, this lecture is also available on YouTube, and it starts just after the first lecture, this time at around 22 minutes and 30. Beforehand, there's a couple of introductions about Professor Henfridsen, and it ends up about 43 minutes, a little bit earlier than that, but there's also a Q&A session that you can watch. So again, I'm asking you to watch this video first before you can try to answer the question yourself, and then I'll talk about my views about this. So in this lecture, I want you not to look at what typical components of organization, such as transaction cost, coordination, or asset management are changing. But here we are talking about how firms usually scale and grow and what is different in digital scaling and growth. Again, if you're interested, also here there's an academic paper available. In fact, there are two. There are two papers by Ola Henfridsen and his colleagues, Yuan Hang and Michael Liu. Both of them are from the University of Warwick. Sue Newell is also from England. And they're both about scaling of digital ventures in two different aspects: rapidly scaling through digital innovation. The other one is through a process that's called templating. Again, both of these papers are provided to you on the course platform if you're interested in reading them. And much like the first lecture, first of all, I'm going to ask you to stop here, watch the online video, and take notes about what is different in firm growth and scaling. Now, what you will learn is that traditionally firms do what's called capital growth, meaning that a firm must invest in more assets, more staff, more factories, more facilities to achieve economies of scale. So in other words, you try to grow, to organize, to produce and sell more at lower cost per unit. So very literally, you can think of it, if you want to sell more Products, you need to open more stores. If you want to produce more items, you need a bigger factory. If you want to reach different markets, you have to have an outlet store in these different places, in these different markets, say in China, say in Asia, say in North America, say anywhere else. So this is capital growth. We need more assets, such as more offices, more factories, more sales and distribution centers. We need more staff. We need more people to do these things at more scale. So one sales agent won't be enough. We need five, we need 10, we need 20. And usually what we're doing is we're organizing these additional assets, this additional capital in a way that every one unit we can produce and can be produced and sold at a lower cost per unit. So we're not building a factory to produce everything at the same cost of production, but ideally, of course, at a lower cost of production. Yeah, so you can think about Volkswagen having very big factories where they can actually not only produce more cars, but also more cars individually at a lower cost per unit. That is a typical growth model. And one aspect of that is it's called the Penrose effect, is that this is good, but of course you need to invest a lot of capital to make this happen. Moreover, very often you need to also hire new assets whose task it is to manage the growth process. Again, a very literal manifestation of that would be that firms, if they need a change because they grow, they literally hire managers to manage the growth. These are called transformation managers, change managers, communication managers, and all these people. These people don't actually work in the factories. They don't sell, they don't distribute. They manage the growth process. So this is an additional capital investment that that firms usually require for growth. Now, how does it work in the digital world? Digital scaling works very differently. One of the things is that digital products typically can be reproduced and distributed at virtually zero cost. Yeah, so put it very bluntly, if you've generated one piece of software and uploaded it, it can be downloaded 10 times, 100 times, a million times. The production cost doesn't change. Because it's a digital item, it can also be sold and distributed at many, many different places, namely everywhere you have an online connection. You don't actually strictly speaking, require sales and distribution offices in different places. So you don't need more production, you don't need more sales or more distribution. So this is one of the advantages of having digital products. Digital venture scaling has certain additional advantages. Typically, it tends to be generative, meaning that the more you scale, the further exponentially more you scale. Yeah, so this is a initial success begets exponential growth or nonlinear growth. So meaning the growth curve is not linear, but it's nonlinear. It gets steeper with time. It's also much faster. Yeah, the rate of change can be much faster than through capital growth. Capital growth, the rate of change means that if you build a new factory, it's going to take you a while. Yeah, Tesla is building new factories in Brandenburg at the moment, and it builds a whole bunch of battery factories anywhere else in Europe. And it's going to take a while until these factories are finished. Yeah. Digital scaling, if you change and update and extend your digital offering, goes much faster. You basically have to upload new versions to a distribution platform, say GitHub or say your app store, and then all of a sudden you can benefit from, let's say, increased attention, more customers, and so forth. And the third big different aspect is that the prime growth mechanism is no longer capital investment. So how much money you put in to build new factories, retail stores, outlets, distribution networks, but rather how many users do you have? This is also why you see that many digital startups that you might know from the internet or you might know from the media, typically they don't care really about revenue growth in the beginning. They only care about user growth because they know that as soon as they're growing their users, they will, in the end, through the nonlinear networks effects and through the positive rate of change, in the end, they will later reach a tipping point where they start becoming economically plus, so where they actually don't run a minus anymore. So the prime growth mechanism is no longer, or the constraint is no longer how much money you put in. The question is rather how many and how fast can you attract new users. This is the end of this first two-part lecture about digital transformation. Thank you for watching.